Hi everyone, welcome to Belle's Books. I'm Carly. Today I want to talk to you about the best non-fiction that I read in 2024. So I have a list of 5 books here, and I will say that non-fiction was a lot better last year than my fiction reading, and that is primarily because I was reading the inaugural Women's Prize for Non-Fiction longlist. So I did try and make my way through the long list. I didn't get there, I didn't read everything, but the books that I did read from it were astounding, and I am so glad that they are running this prize because it directed me to books that I wouldn't have picked up otherwise. So at the top of my list is, shall I do it that way? Yeah, I'm just going to go 1 to 5. My favourite non-fiction book of last year was A Flat Place by Noreen Masud. Now, the subtitle of this is Moving Through Empty Landscapes, Naming Complex Trauma. I really like the premise of this book. So Noreen Masud is talking about flat landscapes, which is interesting to me because I live in Cambridgeshire and there are a lot of flat landscapes around me, and I work now in the Fens, which is a flat landscape. So I was intrigued by this premise, and it really is a love letter to flat landscapes, which often get a bad rep. So people tend to, like, generally think about flat landscapes as weird, creepy, eerie, because you can see quite a distance, right? So it was really nice and refreshing to read a book that praised flat landscapes. And Noreen Masud travels around the UK, so she goes to the Fens. So it was nice because I recognised the places that she went to, like Ely, and the particular landscape that she was describing. She goes up north. I can't remember where the other places are that she goes to, but I really appreciated the beautiful descriptions of those landscapes. That's something that I really enjoy reading about anyway. I also really appreciated the mix of different formats of this book. So it is part memoir, it is part travel writing, it's about geography, history, particularly literary history. So she looks at things like poetry and folklore, and the legacy of colonialism, because she is a British Pakistani woman. So I just loved that. I thought it was incredibly erudite and insightful. There were such beautifully written passages in here. I listened to this on audiobook, and the problem I have with listening to non-fiction on audiobook is that I'm often moving around when I'm listening to audiobooks. So I'm either driving or I'm walking about. That means I can't take notes. So I feel like I would really benefit from reading this book in physical form, because I would love to be able to take notes in the margin and copy passages down into my notebook. So it's definitely one that I want to reread. It reminded me of Olivia Laing's To the River, in terms of the way it blended that kind of different lots of different aspects, so the literary history and geography and memoir. So the main kind of thrust behind the narrative of A Flat Place is Noreen Masud interrogating her own complex trauma that she had from her childhood in Lahore. Her father was a very difficult man, and so there's a lot of trauma bound up in her early childhood and her relationship with him and how that's impacted her. She's an academic and a literary critic now. And sorry, I got momentarily distracted because a squirrel just jumped a large from one branch to another. They do this all the time. It's so frustrating because I'm just trying to concentrate and all I can see is these squirrels leaping about all the place. It's beautiful though, I do love it. Anyway, so yeah, she's talking about complex trauma and the way that she has kind of linked that in her mind to flat landscapes. So it's not that she doesn't like flat landscapes, she loves them, because she associates like the flat plains of Lahore when she was travelling in a car in her childhood to this open space. So there's a really kind of interesting and insightful conversation that she's having about the way we think about landscape, the way we place certain emphasis on it, or landscape in general, and the way we relate to it. I just find that so interesting. So I love that book. I just found it fascinating. Would highly recommend it, and I definitely want to reread it very soon. Next on my list is Matrescence by Lucy Jones, and the subtitle of this book is The Metamorphosis of Pregnancy, Childbirth and Motherhood. Now, I would not have picked this up if it wasn't for the Women's Prize for Nonfiction, because I am not a mother, I have never had children, so it's not something that I ever thought I wanted to read about. I'm also very squeamish. Anything to do with bodily things, pregnancy particularly, grosses me out. And there were parts in this book where I was just like, I had to like, come on, push through. But oh my god, this book was so amazing. I loved it so much. I learned so much from this book. And I found it so, again, insightful. Lucy Jones is a nature writer and a journalist, and she kind of prefaces each chapter with examples from the natural world on how motherhood in various species happens, right? So there's some really kind of like fascinating detail about about the natural world. Like, there's a species, like, this is never going to leave my brain, there's a species of spider that will, when its babies hatch, it will sacrifice itself, and the babies will eat the mother's body. Like, what? That blew my mind, but also served as a very nice kind of analogy for the sacrifice of motherhood. So I really appreciated her natural world examples, found those really fascinating. But she talks about the science behind the changes in women's bodies during motherhood. Again, I just found that so fascinating, because it's not something I've ever really thought about. Just little things that blew my mind, like brains. There are fetal cells in the mother's brain from her baby decades after she's had her baby. Like, what? So it talks about the psychological and physiological changes that happen to a woman when she is pregnant and gives birth, and postpartum, and so on. So I just found that really interesting to learn about in general. There is also an incredible amount of social commentary on the way that motherhood is thought about in our culture, particularly in terms of the way that it's not really marked as a life change in the way that other life changes are. So like, you think about adolescence, we see that as a significant life change, and we mark certain points in our lives as like progressive, but motherhood is one of those ones that kind of is belittled and isn't given the gravitas that it deserves in terms of the extreme and extraordinary changes that are wrought upon the person having that baby. So both like the physical changes and the psychological changes. So again, this is part memoir, because Jones talks about her own experience of having children, again, which is like brutal. And interestingly, I attended a talk at the Cambridge Literary Festival that Lucy Jones was giving about her book, and the room was full of women that had children, right? And there were also children in the audience. That's the first time I've ever seen children allowed in the audience at a Cambridge Lit Fest event. But the amount of women that were weeping, both in the audience and afterwards at the signing queue, saying to her, thank you for writing this book, because it's the first time that they've had their experience like represented, and they feel seen, because there's certain things that you shouldn't feel as a mother, which is like taboo and ridiculous. But Lucy Jones exposes all of this kind of, ridiculousness, and just saying, well, it's such a major life change. Of course you're going to feel these things. She talks about sense of self and like losing yourself when you become a mother, and the fact that there is very little support for new mothers. And generally she talks about like a societal structure and the way that kind of where we are in late stage capitalism, and in these insular family units, means that so much is put on mothers to do everything, and that's not the way that we should be working, right? If you think about like back in the day when we all lived in these tribes, everyone helped to care for children, everyone helped to care for the elderly. It was a group initiative to look after each other, and now it's not like that. It's the woman does the mothering, the woman looks after the elderly people, and it's just too much. So she talks about modes of care and collective care, and the ways that it could be other than it is now, which I found super interesting. Again, just very insightful. Loved it. Would recommend that to everybody, particularly if you've had children. Also, if you haven't had children, I just think everyone should read it, especially men. Okay. Oh, I've lost my page. Then number 3 on my list is I'm Glad My Mum Died by Jennette McCurdy. This is a memoir. I didn't know who Jennette McCurdy was. I kind of knew that she was an American TV star. Didn't really know anything about her. I'd never seen what she was in. This memoir is, again, very brutal and dark. Massive trigger warnings for kind of neglect, abuse and eating disorders. So this memoir is about Jennette McCurdy describing her relationship with her mother as she's growing up and becoming a child star. Her mother was very pushy and pushed her into a career in acting that she didn't really want to do. She also taught her anorexia, which kind of blew my mind. So as Jennette was getting older and developing and moving into her teenage years, she was developing breasts, and she was getting older, and her mother wanted her to get the younger roles. So she like explained to her about calorie restriction, which is basically anorexia, and so she made her daughter anorexic, which then turned into bulimia. But I mean, there was so much abuse in that relationship, but the way that it was dealt with was very much like her mother loved her so much, but the abuse was very intense. Not like physical abuse, but the like obviously teaching her an eating disorder and the way that she would control everything. Like the woman showered her daughter up until she was 17, 18. She wouldn't let her do it herself. Just like, it blew my mind. And your heart breaks for this woman, honestly. And so it's not just the fact that all of this was going on, but Jennette McCurdy loved her mum so much and was in so much awe of her that she didn't think anything was wrong. And when she first got a therapist, her therapist was like, this is not okay what your mum was doing. And Jennette couldn't handle the fact that this therapist was saying her mum was wrong in the way that she did everything. And so she kind of like got rid of that therapist. I was like, oh my goodness, so much damage, so much trauma was inflicted on this woman. So it really was very moving and heartbreaking. And I listened to the audiobook as well on this, and Jennette read it herself. One thing I found was that I thought I had to keep checking the speed on it because I was listening to it at normal speed, but she reads it really fast. And I did think that was interesting. Like, I know she wrote the book, but is it difficult for her to go over it again and read these parts, particularly some of the more difficult parts about the way that her mother showered her and did those kinds of things, which are, you know, really disturbing. So yeah, it was a very intense read, but I would recommend it if you can go into it with knowing those trigger warnings. 4th on my list is Wifedom, Mrs. Orwell's Invisible Life by Anna Funder. This is a biography of George Orwell's wife, Eileen O'Shaughnessy, who I knew nothing about. And again, this was beautifully written. This is a mixture. So it's a biography of Eileen O'Shaughnessy, and Anna Funder goes into letters that she wrote. So she wrote letters to a friend and to her husband, George Orwell. But the interesting thing that she picks up on is the incredible omissions in George Orwell's own like letters and work of his wife, and so she drills down into kind of the sexism and misogyny that was at large in their marriage. The way he treated her was appalling. And this woman, Eileen O'Shaughnessy, was so intelligent, and Fonda traces this idea that Eileen was not just like a wife and she looked after him and she did everything for him, but she typed up his manuscripts and she contributed intellectually to the creation of his work. So Animal Farm was pretty much her idea, I think. And so, yeah, I found that so interesting. She goes through all of Orwell's works, and she traces the points, particularly in Homage to Catalonia, which is a non-fiction about his time in the Spanish Civil War, and looks at the place of Eileen in that narrative. Like, he's completely left her out, but she was such an important figure in what was happening during that time. Like, she was instrumental in saving his skin multiple times, and he just he was not a good husband. Also was a sexual predator, and a lot of conflicted things about the way he felt about women and the way he treated women. So I always had George Orwell in my mind as like this great figure. Not so much anymore. Which is a real shame, but I feel, and I now want to go back and read his work with that in my mind. I think that would be really interesting, actually. So yes, I really loved that book. I also really appreciated the passages that were written. There were small passages that she'd written like in fictional terms. So she'd taken an incident that she knew had happened based on Eileen's letters, and she would kind of write an account of that particular scene. And I just found that so beautiful and, again, insightful. I really love those little glimpses into what might have happened. And she kind of, I've got a quote here. Let me just read it to you, because she said, "So my homemade ground rules for a fiction that tries not to lie. Eileen will live writing the letters she did, 6 to her best friend, 3 to her husband, and a few others. In this story, the lines are hers. Sometimes I write a scene based on what happened. Mostly I supply only what a film director would, describing an actor on set, the wiping of spectacles, the ash on the carpet, a cat pouring itself off her lap." Oh. And those passages, I adored them. I thought they were beautiful. So yeah, she just kind of pieces all this information that she's got from historical sources, like all of these letters and Orwell's own work, to form a picture of the life of this woman who has been cut out of history. Yeah, and I just found it so incredibly heartbreaking, moving, interesting, and I feel like she's done a real service for reinstating someone who otherwise would not be kind of well known at all, because yeah, Orwell just kind of cut her out, I guess. So yeah, I feel like very appreciative to Anna Fonda for writing that book, and I just loved it so much. Okay, and the last one on my list is a very short book that I actually have with me, because all those other books were I read library books of, so I don't have them. The last book on my list is Recognising the Stranger on Palestine, a Narrative by Isabella Hammad. Now, this is a text of a lecture that she gave. When was it? She gave this lecture 9 days before the 7th of October 2023. So it is the text of the lecture that she gave, which is about narrative, and it was delivered for the Edward Said lecture at Columbia University. Edward Said was a Palestinian-American academic and literary scholar and political activist. So she is kind of looking back to his work. He was one of the kind of founders of post-colonial studies. And she's talking about narrative, and particularly this idea of the stranger in narrative, and thinking about that in terms of the Palestinian struggle for freedom under occupation in Israel. At the end, there is a short chapter which was written afterwards. So the afterward was written in the early weeks of 2024, during the ongoing genocide in Gaza, and it's a reflection on what's happening and what's still continuing to happen. Like, despite the ceasefire, Israel have obliterated Gaza, and so she reflects on that. But I find this so interesting. It's one of those texts that I can keep going back to, because she talks about Edward Said as a thinker, did a lot of his work on kind of literary criticism and thinking through things in terms of the novel. So that's really interesting to me because I'm a literary scholar as well. And yeah, I just really appreciated that, and particularly in terms of this idea of the stranger in narrative. So she talks about things like Shakespeare is often using recognition and disguise, and that kind of theme in narrative, the way that you have this idea of a stranger and then they become familiar, or maybe someone familiar becomes a stranger. And that is read very much through the way that Palestinians are treated as the other, in terms of how they're seen by Israelis. So I just wanted to read this little excerpt from you. So even as the question of Palestine continues to capture more of the mainstream of that left, even as more and more people cotton onto the realities of settler colonialism and ethnic cleansing, to the fact that Zionist ideology is ethnocentric and expansionist, and to the pernicious fiction that this is a fight between two equal sides, individual moments of recognition are repeatedly overwhelmed by the energy of a political establishment that tells the onlooker, this is not what it looks like, it's too complicated to understand, look away. And I find that kind of so resonant, because at the beginning of the genocide in Palestine, there were a lot of people that were not speaking out about it because, and I was really disappointed with some people, particularly some kind of, you know, some big names that could have used their platforms and didn't, saying things like, oh, it's very complicated, I can't comment, and calling it a war when it was clearly not a war, it's a genocide, and it always has been. So I found that particular passage really resonant, and still even now, people not talking about it and not calling it out is still very frustrating, and heartbreaking, and really hard to see humanity just putting up with this genocide and just going about their business because they don't care. So I found this kind of really not comforting, but like really important to read, because it felt like everything that she is saying is what I'm screaming in my head all the time. So I would highly recommend this. Like I say, it's very small, it's only like 80 pages, and it's one of the books that I I'm trying to read a bit more about the occupation, and again the history of the way that the Palestinians have been treated in Israel. So yeah, I just found this really interesting. Okay, they are my top 5. They are my top 5 non-fiction for 2024. Now I don't know if most of them were actually published in 2024. Should have looked that up, but I didn't. But anyway, so there's my top 5, and all of them were incredible. So I'm really looking forward to the announcement of the Women's Prize for Non-Fiction, which is coming up very soon, because this was such an interesting read, this non-fiction long list for me. So I'm definitely going to be keeping an eye on what comes out on the long list and aim to get my hands on those. Please do tell me if you've read any of these books, or if you're going to, now that I've talked about them. drop me a note in the comments to tell me what you thought about these books. And the next thing I'm going to do is talk about my graphic novel reads of 2024, because that was a new thing for me. So I will speak to you very soon in another video. I hope you're all doing okay. Sending lots of love. Bye everyone.